Hi, in this segment I cover fields, signatures, parameters, accessor methods, mutator methods, how objects actually store variables, and then we finish up with a fun little look at Apple's Lisa computer, which was released in 1983. So first, let's get the work over with. We have here the code from the naive ticket machine class in your textbook. I've stripped out all the comments just to make this easier to fit on the screen. First, let's focus up here on this segment, which I'll pull out a bit so that we can really focus on it. These three things are fields. There are three integer fields, and fields exist for the entire class, and they are outside of any methods. So you'll notice that these three variables are defined right after the opening brace of the class, and they're not inside of a method. So we know it's a field because it's not inside of any method, and the fields exist throughout, are available to any of the methods of the class. The private means that, in fact, if we make an object of ticket machine, objects of other types do not have direct access to these fields because they're private. But within the class itself, any of the methods do have direct access to the fields, and again, the fields exist through as long as the object of the class exists and are available throughout all the methods of the class. Okay, next let's look at this. We have two boxes here. First, let's focus on the outer big box. This is the signature of a method. Now, signatures have a number of parts to them. They have public or private at the beginning, indicating whether or not, if it's public, it means the method is available, can be called from outside the class. If it's private, it means only other methods of the class can call that method. It has a return type or not in this case. Now, the only methods that don't have return types are constructors. So even if we didn't notice that the name of this method is exactly the same as the name of the class, we would know that this was a constructor. Now let's focus on this. What is this? Let's bring this out and so we can really focus on it. This is obviously within parentheses. Its ticket cost is some sort of variable of type integer, meaning it holds integer values. This type of variable, when it's in the signature of a method, is called a parameter. And its purpose is to hold values that the method needs passed in order to accomplish its task. Now, when I say passed in, it means that the method needs some value from outside passed into it in order to do whatever it is it's supposed to do. In this case, it needs an integer value passed in, and that integer value we know because of the meaningful name of the variable, or the parameter, is going to represent the ticket cost. So let's pull that guy back down. Next up, let's look at this. Let's look at the method header first. So it's public, which means that this method can be called from outside the object. It returns an integer value, so we know it's not a constructor right away. And of course, it doesn't have the same name as the class, so that's another reason it's not a constructor. This method, let's pull it out a bit. Woohoo! It's irritating, isn't it? Let's go back. Pull it out a little bit. there. All right, this method has the parameter parentheses, but there's no parameter because this method doesn't require any value in order to do what it's supposed to do. Now you'll notice that it returns balance, which in this class is the amount of money that has been entered, which is an integer value in this case. And so any method that returns a value that is stored in a field, right? Balance is a field. So this method is accessing that field, which is private, so it's not directly accessible from outside objects. But we can have those objects, or we can gain access to it via the BlueJ. You know, if we're calling the methods directly from an object on the object doc, we can gain access to balance by calling this method, which goes and gets what's in balance and returns it to us. So this is known as an accessor method because it accesses these private fields of the class. All right, let's look at this method. This method is public as well, meaning it can be called from outside. It doesn't return anything, void here, but it requires an amount to be passed into it. Now what happens with that amount? It gets added to the balance field, and then the sum of that addition gets restored in balance. So this method is actually mutating or changing, mutating is just a fancy name for changing, the balance field. So if we have a method that modifies a field, then that method is known as a mutator method. Okay. What does this represent? Well, I think it's important to understand that when Java makes an object out of a class, it doesn't actually store very much in that object. In fact, the only things it really stores are fields. You notice the 3 fields here. Each object will have its own versions of those fields. And it stores sort of pointers or references to the methods of the class. So that if you call one of those methods, the object knows where to go to actually find out what the code is in that method. Now you notice that it doesn't, within the object itself, we're not actually storing parameters. So there's no ticket cost variable here, and there's no amount variable here. How those are handled, we'll get to a little later. But it's important to understand that objects are very, there's not much in them other than the fields and the references to the methods of the class. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Lisa. The Lisa was the first large-scale graphical user interface computer that was ever available for the public to buy. The Xerox Star was actually the first, but it was very expensive and really only purchased by large corporations. And even then, not very many units were sold. The Lisa actually had a mouse, which was one of the first computers with a mouse, and had a floppy disk drive and this little screen. And we can actually take a look at a photograph of it here, which is kind of interesting because here's the mouse. If you look at what's on the screen, you see a lot of the elements which are still being used on computer screens. And this is really the first time that people had these elements on their screens. Before this, most computers used command line interfaces. You had a little prompt over on the left side and you'd type a command. Whatever that command was, if you typed it correctly, the computer would execute it. But with Lisa, the beginning of a graphical, we see the beginning of a graphical user interface, and you see the menus here, you see a window, you see icons within the window which represent folders or documents or programs. And down here we see a trash can. So way back in 1983, many of the elements which we're all familiar with now were already present on the user interface of the Lisa. So as I mentioned, it was released, I think I mentioned it was released in 1983, cost $10,000 at the time, which in inflation-adjusted dollars would be over $21,000 today. So it was really a very expensive computer. And you can look through some of the other specs. And a fun exercise would be to compare these to the specs of a modern Apple computer, say an iMac, and see how the specs compare between the two. Lisa, apparently, well, Lisa was the name of Apple co-founder Steve Jobs' daughter. So many people think that that's why the computer was named Lisa. So you can find out much more about Lisa just by going into Google, typing Apple Lisa. But this, again, was an important computer in the history of personal computers because it was the first personal computer with a graphical user interface and a mouse. So that's it for now. Talk to you soon.